this group was facilitating a conversation around racism. And I remember it was a particularly challenging conversation. I think there were some students who, to greater or lesser degrees, uncomfortable with what was happening, but not uncomfortable in the sense of like, I don't want to learn this, but just like, wow, I'm learning a lot, and that's creating, sort of cognitive dissonance, or at least something that I'm having to learn. And one young woman stood up and she said, look, we have to do this together. That's the only way that we're going to change. So if someone tells you that they've experienced racism in whatever way, it doesn't matter if that's something that you've ever experienced yourself. You have to believe them. That's the only way that we can move forward. And you could have heard a pin drop. Like the whole room went silent, and then everybody just clapped.
So a favorite memory for me occurred during the early days of the pandemic, when a former student from maybe 7 years ago wrote me a letter, a handwritten letter. It was one of the assignments that I give in class. It's to handwrite a letter to two people. And she wrote me a letter and she said, because obviously that was a time of a lot of contemplation for a lot of people, and she said, my first letter, she said, I'm getting ready to write a bunch of letters to a lot of people, but my first letter is to you. And she wrote about how the course content, how the conversations, how the theory, how the research really changed her life, in the sense of, it really moved me. I bawled reading this letter about how she chose her career and then changed the career and all of these things. And she took 2 to 3 classes with me, and so she reflected on all of these things.
I developed this class called, it used to be called Journalism in Latin America. And I remember a student coming to me and saying, my dad was shocked that I was taking a class called Journalism in Latin America, because, he said, what, they're gonna teach you from Latin America, kind of. And I was about to respond, and she said, no, but I responded to him, Dad, I'm understanding more about freedom of the press and about things that we take for granted in this country, about freedom of expression and First Amendment, etc., by looking at the struggle of other people's trying to get that. And I think that was a great moment for me, because I always now repeat this story to the other classes, and I had a chance in the graduation to visit with the parents and have that conversation. I think it was very illuminating for me in terms of the importance of being in this great university that has a global perspective.
In 2016, I took 4 students from our school to the Summer Olympics in Rio de Janeiro, Brazil. And half the time they worked for the English language Olympics website. The other half of the time they did freelance stories. We solicited freelance assignments in the months before the Olympics. I figured there would be interest because so many newspapers can't afford to send their own staff to something like that. I was surprised at how much interest we got. By the end of the Olympics, my students had completed 47 bylined stories from the Olympics, ranging from swimming to wrestling to fencing to sailing and even track and field.
The greatest comment that I ever received from a student was very simple, actually. I had been talking with someone about something in my office hours, going over some key terms, and they just said to me, you're a really great explainer. And to me, that is the simplest but most powerful concept, especially as someone who teaches communication. For someone to say, you're so good at taking this thing that is abstract or difficult to learn, or I hadn't been able to know before, and making it accessible. I just love learning so much that helping someone else learn, that was the best compliment I'd ever received.
I was intending to go to law school, but for some reason I kept being asked to help people write their papers. I had a lot of friends who were engineers and math majors and accountants, and they all had to take classes where they had to do some writing, and they hated writing. And I found myself being besieged by them to help them write their papers. And and for no money, by the way. One Saturday morning, I was helping a student in the business school, a friend of mine, write a paper about Napoleon, and I led some questions, and he finally went around, and then he said, well, maybe I could say such and such. And I pointed him and I said, bingo. And his eyes lit up. And I realized at that moment that I had planted something in his head that he thought was fully his own. And it was kind of a devious kind of pleasure that I got realizing that I had led him to an answer and he didn't notice my leading him there. And I thought, God, that's really magic. And I love the look on his face when he felt that he had hold of a new idea. And at that moment, I stopped thinking about going to law school.